Chapter 11. Who Stole the Tarts? The King and Queen of Hearts were seated on their throne when they arrived, with a great crowd assembled about them, all sorts of little birds and beasts, as well as the whole pack of cards. The knave was standing before them in chains, with a soldier on each side to guard him, and near the king stood the white rabbit, with a trumpet in one hand and a scroll of parchment in the other. In the very middle of the court was a table, with a large dish of tarts upon it. They looked so good, thought Alice. It made her quite hungry to look at them. I wish they'd get this trial done already, she thought, and hand us round the refreshments. But there seemed to be no chance of this, so she began looking at everything about her to pass away the time. Alice had never been in a court of justice before, but she had read about them in books, and she was quite pleased to find she knew the name of nearly everything there. That's the judge, she said to herself. I know this because of his great white wig. The judge, by the way, was actually the King of Hearts, and as he wore his crown over the wig, he did not look at all comfortable, and it was certainly not very becoming, thought Alice. She looked around her and noticed what she thought to be the jury box. There were 12 creatures inside, and she was obliged to think creatures, you see, because some of them were animals and some others were birds. I suppose they are all the jurors. She said this last word 2 or 3 times to herself. They're jurors. 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 She was rather proud of this, for she thought, and rightly so, that very few little girls of her age knew the meaning at all. However, jurymen would have done just as well, she thought. The 12 jurors were all writing very busily on slates. What are they doing? Whispered Alice to the Griffin. They can't have anything to put down yet before the trial's begun. They're writing down their names, the Griffin whispered in reply, for fear they should forget them before the end of the trial. Well, what stupid things they are, then, Alice said in a loud, indignant voice. But she stopped hastily, for the white rabbit cried out, Silence in the court! And the king put on his spectacles and looked anxiously around to look at who was talking. Alice could see, as well as if she were looking over their shoulders, that all the jurors were writing down stupid things on their slates, and she could even make out that one of them didn't know how to spell the word stupid, and that he had to ask his neighbor to tell him. A nice muddle their slates will be in before the trial's over, thought Alice. One of the jurors had a pencil that squeaked on the paper. This, of course, Alice could not stand, and she went round the court and got behind him, and very soon found an opportunity of taking it away. She did it so quickly that the poor little juror, his name was Bill, and he was a lizard, could not make out at all what had become of it, So, after hunting all about, he was obliged to write with one finger for the rest of the day. And this was really of very little use, for his finger left no mark on the slate. "Herald," the king shouted, "read us the accusation." On this, the white rabbit blew 3 blasts on his trumpet, and then he unrolled his parchment scroll and read as follows. "The Queen of Hearts, she made some tarts, all on a summer's day. The Knave of Hearts, he stole those tarts, and he took them quite away." "Consider your verdict now," the king said to the jury. "Not yet, not yet," the rabbit hastily interrupted. "There's a great deal to come before that." "Okay then, call your first witness," said the king. And the white rabbit blew 3 blasts on his trumpet, and he called out, "First witness." The first witness was the Hatter. He came in with a teacup in one hand and a piece of bread and butter in the other. "I beg your pardon, your majesty," he began. "I beg your pardon for bringing these in, but I hadn't quite finished my tea when I was sent for." "Well, you ought to have finished," said the king. "When on earth did you begin?" The Hatter looked over at the March Hare, who had followed him into the court, arm in arm with the Dormouse. 14th of March, I think it was," he said. "No, it was the 15th, said the March Hare. "No, it was the 16th, said the Dormouse. "Write that down," the king said to the jury, and the jury eagerly wrote down all 3 dates on their slates, and then added them up and reduced the answer to shillings and pence. "Take off your hat," the king said to the Hatter. "It isn't mine," said the Hatter. "It's a stolen hat?" the king exclaimed. He turned to the jury, who instantly made a memorandum of the fact. "I have them to sell," the Hatter added as an explanation. "I've actually no hats of my own. I'm a Hatter." Here, the queen put on her spectacles and began staring at the Hatter, who turned pale and fidgeted. "Give your evidence then," said the king, "and don't be nervous, or I'll have you executed on the spot." This did not seem to encourage the witness at all. He kept shifting from one foot to the other. He looked uneasily at the queen, and in his confusion he bit a large piece out of his teacup instead of taking a bite of his bread and butter. Just at this moment, Alice felt a very curious sensation. This puzzled her a good deal until she could make out what it was. She was beginning to grow larger again, and she thought at first she would get up and leave the court. But on second thought, she decided to remain where she was, as long as there was room for her. "I wish you wouldn't squeeze so," said the Dormouse, who was sitting next to her. "I can hardly breathe." "I can't help it," Alice said, very meekly. "I'm growing. It's not my fault, though." "Well, you've no right to grow here," said the Dormouse. "Don't talk nonsense," said Alice more boldly. "You know you're growing, too." "Yes," said the Dormouse, "but I I grow at a reasonable pace, not in that ridiculous fashion of yours." And he got up very sulkily and crossed over to the other side of the court. All this time, the queen had never left off staring at the Hatter, and just as the Dormouse crossed the court, she said to one of the officers, "Bring me the list of the singers in that last concert," on which the wretched Hatter trembled so. He shook both of his shoes off in his fear. "Give your evidence now," the king repeated angrily, "or I'll have you executed, whether you're nervous or not." "I'm just a poor man, your majesty," the Hatter began. His voice trembled. "And I hadn't begun my tea, not a week or so ago. And what with the bread and butter getting so thin, and then the twinkling of the tea." "The twinkling of what?" asked the king. "It began with the tea," the Hatter replied. "Of course, twinkling begins with a T," the king replied sharply. "Do you take me for a fool? Go on with your story now." The Hatter went on slowly. "I'm a poor man, as I said, and most things twinkled after that, except the March Hare said—" "No, I didn't," the March Hare interrupted in a great hurry. "You did so," said the Hatter. "I'll deny it," said the March Hare. "He denies it," said the king. "Leave out that part. Go on with your story, Hatter." "Well, at any rate, the Dormouse said," the Hatter went on. He looked anxiously around to see if he could deny it too, but the Dormouse denied nothing, as he was already fast asleep. "After that," continued the Hatter, "I cut some more bread and butter." "But what did the Dormouse say?" one of the jury members asked. "Now I can't remember," said the Hatter. "You must remember," said the king, "or I'll have you executed." The miserable Hatter dropped his teacup and dropped his bread and butter, and he got down on one knee. "I'm a very poor man, your majesty," he said. "I disagree," said the king. "You're a very poor speaker." Here, one of the guinea pigs cheered and was immediately suppressed by the officers of the court. Alice was surprised at the use of the word suppressed in her mind, and as it is a rather hard word, she thought to herself how they had done it. The officers had a large canvas bag, which tied up at the mouth with strings. Into this they slipped the guinea pig head first, and then sat upon him. "I'm glad I've seen that done," thought Alice to herself. "I've so often read in the newspapers, at the ends of trials, there was some attempts at applause, which was immediately suppressed by the officers of the court. And as I saw it in the newspapers, I never understood what it meant until now." "If that's all you know about it, you may stand down," said the king to the Hatter. "I can't go any lower," said the Hatter. "I'm already on the floor as it is." "I meant you may sit down," the king replied. Here another guinea pig cheered, and was also suppressed and sat upon. "Come now, that finished the guinea pigs," thought Alice. "I guess now we'll get on better with this trial." "Actually, your majesty, I'd rather finish my tea," said the Hatter. He looked over at the Queen anxiously, and she appeared to be reading the list of singers. "You may go," said the King. When the Hatter hurriedly left the court, he didn't even put his shoes on. "And just take his head off outside then," the Queen added to one of the officers. But the Hatter was out of sight before the officer could get out the door. "Call the next witness," said the King. The next witness was the Duchess's cook. She carried the pepper box in her hand, and Alice guessed who it was even before she got into the court, by the way the people near the door began sneezing all at once. "Give your evidence now," said the King. "I cannot," said the cook. The King looked anxiously at the White Rabbit, who said in a low voice, "Your Majesty must cross-examine this witness." "Well, if I must, I must," the King said. He looked about with a melancholy air, and after folding his arms and frowning at the cook until his eyes were nearly out of sight, he said in a deep voice, "Tell me, what are tarts made from?" "Pepper mostly," said the cook. "And also treacle," said a sleepy voice behind her. "Collar that dormouse," the King said. "Actually behead that dormouse. Turn that dormouse out of my court. Suppress him, pinch him, pull off his whiskers." For some minutes, the whole court was in confusion, getting the dormouse out, and by the time they had settled down again, the cook had disappeared. "Never mind," said the King, with an air of great relief. "Call the next witness." And he added in an undertone to the Queen, "Really, my dear, you must cross-examine the next witness. This is making my forehead ache." Alice watched the White Rabbit as he fumbled over the list, feeling very curious to see what the next witness would be like, for they hadn't gotten any evidence yet, she thought to herself. Imagine her surprise when the White Rabbit read out at the top of his voice, "Alice, it's your turn."